Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Holly Rosenfink. I'm from Westchester Jewish Center's SOJAC committee. And on behalf of SOJAC, we're so honored to be joined by Dawn Porter, the director and producer of John Lewis Good Trouble, and Kostya Kennedy, a member of our congregation, who will interview Dawn. First, I just want to tell you all a little bit about SOJAC. SOJAC is a social justice action committee of Westchester Jewish Center. As Jews, we are commanded to not stand idly by when faced with society's ills, be it through feeding the hungry or protesting as a community where there is discrimination in our midst. SOJAC has a task of presenting ways for our synagogue to abide by those words. In showing the film, John Lewis Good Trouble, which I hope you all had a chance to watch, and hosting Dawn, we are deepening the work of our synagogue community and asking, what is our responsibility in addressing intolerance? I'd like to introduce you to Kostya Kennedy in a moment. I also want to tell you about him before we start. He is a member of WJC and an editorial director at Meredith Corporation and a former senior writer and assistant managing editor at Sports Illustrated. He is also the New York Times bestselling author of 56, Joe DiMaggio, and The Last Magic Number in Sports and Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. He is currently writing a book about Jackie Robinson. So you're all going to have an opportunity to hear from Kostya and Dawn in a moment. But before you do, I just want to tell you briefly about our format. First of all, we will be showing clips from the film throughout the interview, which could take us slightly over the 12 p.m. end time. So we hope you can stick around. And while you're listening, if you have a question, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, at the side of your screen actually, to type in a question. And at the end of our program, we'll choose a few of these questions to read to Dawn for her response, or as many as we can. We're also recording this conversation and we'll make the link available to you immediately after to share with your friends and family. And with that, we're gonna get started. But first off, I want to welcome our Rabbi Arnowitz, to say a few words. Rabbi?
Thank you, Holly, and thank you all for being here. It is a great honor and a wonderful opportunity to have Dawn Porter with us and to have take part in this conversation. This past summer, when racial tensions and protests were running very hot around the killing of several Black individuals by police authorities, many of you came to me and said, boy, this feels like this just happened a few years ago, and haven't we moved forward at all? And had a sense of frustration and a sense of interest. And we committed ourselves, myself and SOJAC, to making sure that this is an issue we really take seriously from this point forward, that we would explore it as a community, understand the connections and the responsibilities when it comes to Judaism and racial justice, historically and what the future may bring. And SOJAC and the Shul committed ourselves to a series of programs around the topic, of which this is one. And I'm proud that we're doing that. There is a lot of good work to be done, a lot of important work to be done. And I'm glad you're all here. It's a beautiful turnout, and it really shows that we are continuing this as a priority, that the interest is maintained as well it should be. The greatest fault we can have is to be upset and angry in the summer and then turn away and forget about it a few months later when it's no longer, the topic is no longer filling our news feeds. To truly take this seriously, we need to stay committed to the education, stay committed to doing the good work necessary. And I'm glad you're all here with us. I thank SOJAC for making this possible. And now I'm going to turn the conversation over to Kostya Kennedy and to Dawn Porter. Really looking forward to your conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Let me just briefly let everybody know just who we are lucky enough to have with us today. Dawn Porter, of course, is the director and producer of John Lewis Good Trouble, which Holly mentioned and which many of you have seen. That's just part of a remarkable and important career she's had and is having as a filmmaker. Her other projects included the documentary Vernon Jordan, Make It Plain, which explores Jordan's rise in the segregated South to become an influential thought leader. The Way I See It, an excellent documentary about photojournalist Pete Souza, who was the official White House photographer for Barack Obama, as well as Ronald Reagan. Dawn directed and produced a Netflix original series, Bobby Kennedy for President. Her film Trapped, which explores laws regulating abortion clinics in the South, won the Special Jury Social Impact Prize at the 2016 Sundance Film Festival, as well as the Peabody and many other awards. Her documentary, Gideon's Army, won Best Editing at Sundance and was also nominated for an Emmy. That's only part of what Dawn has done. She's currently directing and executive producing a documentary series with Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry, which is titillating in itself, but even more appetizing, perhaps, is what she mentioned just before the call that she was shooting yesterday with Marcus Samuelsson, the wonderful chef who had Aquavit and now has Red Rooster. And in Dawn's word, it was a good experience, but too much food. So anyway, we're enormously pleased and grateful to have you here, Dawn. This is where in normal times there would be thunderous applause, but there can't be. So I extend them to you on behalf of all of us, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for this lovely and warm welcome. I have to thank my friend Devora Rubino, who connected me to your lovely congregation. Devora and I work together at ABC. My background is I'm a lawyer, and I worked for ABC Television and then ABC News before doing filmmaking, and Devora was one of my first friends there. So it's nice to have that connection back, and I haven't seen her for a long time, so this is extra special, but I'm really, really happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, as Holly mentioned, we're going to see a few clips along the way, but I just wanted to get started with a couple of thoughts and from you more generally. It struck me, and thinking about that we were going to do this together, that the very first thing that Kamala Harris said in her victory speech in November, the first words were to invoke John Lewis, the subject of your documentary. And she said, democracy is not a state, it is an act. I guess tell us just personally, where were you? I'm guessing you were watching that. What did you feel when you saw that? And then maybe you could expand a little bit on what Congressman Lewis meant by that.
Yeah, I think it has been such a joy to see so many elected officials. President Obama gave Mr. Lewis's eulogy, certainly around inauguration, around election time, so many elected officials, quoted the congressman. I think he really set a model for so many people's lives, a standard for people to aspire to. And I think what is so admirable about his life and his career is the congressman was one of the most non-judgmental people I've ever met. He really looked inward to determine what he felt was a righteous path, and that was a path of inclusiveness. And I think in invoking his name and his activity, she was not only pointing to democracy, small d, but also, a generous and welcoming and inclusive path. And I think that really, as your rabbi has said, which I agree with so deeply, I think so many of us were horrified and moved to act this spring, but that work continues. And by invoking his name and his message and his life and his activities, I think that's a way of connecting us and looking to, to a peaceful path together.
Yeah, at the very beginning of Good Trouble, John Lewis looks into the camera and he says, there are forces today trying to take us back to another time and another dark period. Now, we can hear that today, 2 weeks after the insurgency. We could have heard that after George Floyd and the other tragedies of the summer. I'm wondering, what was the context he was saying that? Was there any specific things he's referring to, or just sort of general reactionary feelings, or what was his thoughts there?
You know, we filmed that in after the midterms, but in the spring of 2019. And so we were looking forward to the 2020 election. And so we were in this period of somewhat hopefulness, having the 2018 midterms, deliver a Democratic House majority. That was extremely important, for him personally. But he was quite aware, I think, of, the danger. And I think it was not hyperbole at all to say there was literally a danger to our democratic processes. I mean, how many of us over the past 4 years have, realized that we assumed that most members of government would at least comply with laws, if not with, some moral obligation. And as, each norm was broken, as, there were no consequences to self-dealing and to corruption, there was this creeping fear that we were really in uncharted territory. And I think what that points to is our democracy is really dependent on a social compact. And it depends on all of us agreeing to abide by certain norms and to abide by laws. And if we do not hold people accountable when they do not abide by moral or ethical or legal obligations, we are really in danger. We are really adrift. And I think that is what he worried about very, very much. And I think because of what he had seen over the course of his life, decades of public service, he really had a fear of the breakdown of those norms that have guided us for so many years.
Yeah, I was going to come to this later, but just one last before we go to clips, because it's relevant to this. At the heart of that, it seems to me like procedurally, it's voting rights, which is, of course, was at the very beginning of his career, and we've seen rollbacks in the past since 2013, which is explored in your film and which had really come to a head now. Was that a particular concern of his, just sort of in the rubber hits the road, kind of beyond any spiritual feeling that's people's votes have to be honored and counted?
When you think about it, John Lewis was in his 20s when he stood by President Johnson, who signed the Voting Rights Act. And then again, in 2018, the first legislation that was introduced, HR 1, was to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. So he saw its first introduction and its results, a 62% increase in voter registration in Mississippi. But then that law being gutted in 2013 with Supreme Court decisions and the immediate consequence, he also saw that he needed to reintroduce the Voting Rights Act in 2018. Amazing. So when he said he feared for democracy, it was, as you say, it was literal. But I do also think, he was very, very concerned about the lack of civil discourse, about the lack of separation among and between people who had been joined for so many years. And I would definitely say, Jewish leaders were instrumental in the civil rights movement, were among the first people to go down to Selma, to go to dangerous places and march and demonstrate and link arms with Black people. And, I think that it was that history. We need to be reminded of that history. It's a very, very important alliance. And I really commend you, Holly, and the members of Social Justice Committee, because I fear that history and that understanding is being lost, that people don't know of that very, very strong alliance. So I think that actually he was really worried about the breakdown of civility, because you have to compromise. You can't be so tribal in your goals. We need to be united. He would always speak about being one people. That was something that was incredibly important to him.
yeah, again, you bring up such interesting stuff. I wanted to explore that connection with Jewish leaders. So let's just do it here really quickly. Just as background for everybody, John Lewis, he won the Elie Wiesel Prize from the U.S. Holocaust Museum in 2016, and that's an award that goes to confront hatred, people who confront hatred and promote human dignity. As you've alluded to, he worked with Heschel, Rabbi Prince, more recently with Rabbi Abraham Cooper, and many, many other people. Just could you talk a little bit about how he viewed that connection? I imagine he viewed it important to have consensus among all faith, but was there something particular about the alliance with Jewish leaders and Jewish thought?
I think there was. I think because he really admired the dedication to social justice that is so integral to the Jewish faith. And that was something that he felt inspired by. He studied religion when he was a very young man, and he really had an affinity for, a faith that made literally as a pillar of, of faith and of practicing religious, belief to be justice, social justice. And so, it's no accident that he and the other civil rights leaders invited Jewish leaders to link arms with them, to march across the bridge, to go on different pilgrimages. And it's so interesting to me because it wasn't, I think it was based out of admiration and inviting kind of he saw so many similarities with what he believed was kind of the Black faith tradition, which also was rooted in social justice. And I think drawing that connection for Black people was very natural.
And was it an interesting, I know personally we talked and you mentioned that you're in an intermarriage and you're raising your children or going to a Jewish school, and is that a connection that was interesting for you yourself to explore as you did this film, or as you've worked on other things? Or
it is interesting. I grew up in New York City, and so as a result, I didn't know that being Jewish was a minority until I was in college. I like literally did not know. I didn't see anti-Semitism, and it was very confusing to me because we're taught to think about racial differences, but not. So having you grow up with kind of surrounded with, in my opinion, like the best of Jewish culture, Jewish food, kind of this social justice tradition. It's really, really important. My family is Robesons and, worked for, so many years. Like, it just didn't occur to me that there was, I was really horrified, personally, and felt it very painfully when I realized how much anti-Semitism there was. And so my husband is Jewish. He's Black. He's Jewish. He's bar mitzvahed, confirmed. Attended a conservative synagogue in Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And that history is important to us. My children's great grandparents, they have relatives who were killed in the Holocaust. They're from Poland. And I think if you're a member of a family, you're a member of a tradition that has been persecuted, it's important to understand your resilience, and the qualities that have taken your people forward. So for my children, that's a Black tradition and also a Jewish tradition. So yeah, so that is extremely important to me. And as I mentioned, I did not convert, but we hosted all the holidays. Like, we figured out a way to incorporate many of the beautiful traditions of Judaism into our lives. So it's also why I'm happy to be here with you. It's very comforting.
And I say amen. That's great. Holly, would you mind playing the first clip that we talked about? Holly, you just have to go back and let that little ad run, I guess, on this one.
In the back, you have a false sense of inferiority. And so long as you let the white man sit in the front and...
Holly, we can hear it, but we can't see it.
Hold on one second. Hold on.
We had robust discussion.
I love that her son is fixing.
The tech.
That is familiar.
Support,
Yeah. Well, why don't we go ahead and move on a little bit? And Holly, when you're ready to start with that, we can go. Oh, maybe here we are. Okay.
When you sit down on the bus and you sit down in the front or you sit down by a white person, you have a duty to sit there because as long as you sit in the back, you have a false sense of inferiority. And so long as you let the white man sit in the front and push you back there, he has a false sense of superiority.
We had robust discussion about these ideas. 6 months of gatherings produced the consensus we're going to desegregate downtown Nashville.
I hated this system telling people that you cannot be seated at a lunch counter. You cannot go into a restaurant simply because of the color of your skin. And I wanted to be part of an effort to help change it. And I was prepared to put my body on the line.
There was something deep down within me, moving me, that I could no longer be satisfied or go along with an evil system.
That's it?
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So that's a very powerful scene, a little clip from the movie, and it's obviously a commitment, Dawn, that is admirable and more than admirable. Awesome, I would say. It's also a little scary, and you know, he said, "I'll put my life on the line," and there were some others in the film who talked about when mothers were begging them not to, right? And you have people who love John Lewis and were around him, his family, his friends. Why do you think? And he clearly not an insensitive man to those feelings. What do you think drove him to be willing to, in fact, risk his life, risk injury, suffer injury for a cause that he was involved in, but was also largely outside himself as well?
Yeah, you know, so we did an enormous amount of archival research to find clips that had not been seen so often. And that clip by Dr. King was very powerful to me, which is you have an obligation as a member of a persecuted group to not abide by the attempt to marginalize you. And I think what that clip for me, there's the power of Dr. King's speech, but then there's also the power of John Lewis saying, people have asked me a lot, what was his motivation? Why did he step up and speak out and risk everything, risk his life? And that's really why. He literally thought, you have to remember, like, he lived in the time of Emmett Till, when you were a Black person looking at a white person in the eye, not looking at a white woman in particular, could literally get you killed. And so to not only, you know, he was from a very small town in Alabama where he was denied a library card. So to leave, you know, his very small town and to face very brutal discrimination, not just discrimination, but, you know, threatens to his life. It was because he thought he didn't want to live a life where he was less than fully human. And he was going to do what he could to change that. So, you know, when people ask about his motivation, it also is, for him, it was a command from God. It was that, you know, we are equal and human, lovingly in God's image. And so that is how he felt commanded to live.
Well, obviously not everyone who's committed to these moral causes does have a faith, but many do. Is that something that you've found the connecting link between other people that you've worked with and made films about?
You know, it is, but with no one as strong as John Lewis. He had a very, you know, the other piece of that clip is that was Reverend Jim Lawson, who studied Gandhi. He studied philosophy. They studied, you know, a number of traditions in coming, you know, to an understanding of what their moral and faith tradition would be. So he wasn't just baptized into a faith tradition or a political affiliation. He chose it intentionally. Jim Lawson still teaches a practice of nonviolence. He teaches that in Los Angeles today. And isn't that, you know, I'm thinking about, I think that there's a film to be made about what nonviolence really means. It is not passive. It is actually strength to be nonviolent in the face of such aggression. But for John Lewis, he is the person with the strongest faith tradition, and that guided him in a very practical way in asserting that he would not let his humanity be compromised by the violence of others. And to him, doing violence to another human being would be disrespectful to his faith. So he would find other ways to pursue, you know, a cause of equality.
Very powerful. Holly, would you mind queuing up the next clip, the rally? Second clip.
This one? Sorry, one more time. So hold on one sec.
I don't know what keeps happening.
Yeah. Go to the here.
I love the questions that you are putting into the clip, into the chat. So I'm eager to get to those too.
I would see those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. And I would ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents why. They would say, boy, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. But in 1955, 15 years old, the action of Rosa Parks, the words and leadership of Dr. King inspired me to get in trouble, what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. It's time for all good people in this state, here in Dallas, to get in trouble. I got arrested a few times during the 60s. 40 times. And since I've been in Congress, another 5 times. And I'm probably going to get arrested again for something. But my philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
Another wonderful clip. So you know, watching that, clearly they're the bright line, I would say, and between violent and nonviolent protest and response. You can hear John Lewis's words and say, well, that could be applied to more reactionary protests as well, right? It's not necessarily what we might consider righteous, as John Lewis was. How is that reconciled? Or do you think he has any thoughts on people who might vehemently disagree with his stance or be advocating for something, as I say, more reactionary, also saying, well, I'm going to get myself in trouble in this nonviolent way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, you know, we talked about this quite a bit. And he faced that very conundrum. You know, Stokely Carmichael, who, you know, part of the Black Panther Party, you know, challenged John Lewis at some point, and Stokely Carmichael won. I mean, there were people who were frustrated, who were tired of you know, turning the other cheek, preaching nonviolence, thinking that was not, you know, effective. And Mr. Lewis's response was the long-term, stable change, you cannot sink to, the behavior of people who you disagree with. And so his view was, it is satisfying in the short term to respond, like with Blake, but in the long term, that was not the long-term change that he was looking for. So when he was challenged by Stokely Carmichael and the other more, people who advocated, violence with violence, he stepped down. And he moved away from his leadership in SNCC. What I love about that clip that we just showed you was filmed while he was campaigning for Beto O'Rourke, for other candidates in Texas. He really fed off of the energy of the crowd, and in challenging people to get involved. So we spent like several days with him, following him on the campaign trail, and he was so energetic. It was very hard to keep up with him. We had I had like a 40-year-old camera person who said, "Is he going to take a break? Because this camera is heavy, I have to put it down." And one Sunday he went to 5 churches and delivered these rousing speeches, challenging people to express their beliefs, to go out and show them. And so I can tell you, we had no idea. He was not diagnosed with cancer while we were filming at all. We completely finished the film. So his diagnosis in December was an utter shock. It was a devastating shock. But I will also tell you that he was able, before his life ended, to see, as he pointed out, people in all 50 states took to the streets in peaceful protest. And not only in all 50 states, but around the world. And that for him was very, very important. He pointed it out. He was delighted. And, I felt like he saw, he certainly was a person who contributed to the urging and the call to action, the call to people to express their beliefs publicly. And that gave him a lot of comfort, in just a few weeks, a few months before he died.
Wonderful. I want to thank you for selecting and sending these clips over, which are really wonderful. And we've just got a couple more. I know we do want to get to the questions, but Holly, could you actually jump to the 4th clip? It's the Nashville protests. I think that would be, if we have just a couple more, if we have time, we'll get to all of them. But usually when I start to talk and say, let's move on, that's when it all comes together. So I'm going to try. There we go.
Did it again.
Organized in Nashville, John Lewis, Diane Nash, and the others.
It was on February the 13th, and we had the very first sit-in here in Nashville. And I took my seat at the counter. I asked the waitress for a hamburger and a Coke.
I said, "I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve niggers in here."
Altogether, it was a moving feeling within me that I was sitting there demanding a God-given right. And in spite of all of this, I had to keep loving the people who denied me service.
They come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
First, we had to change. And since we were no longer going to accept segregated lunch counters, it was over with. We protested because we had changed. We continued to give them the opportunity to also change because we believed that it was possible.
and extremely powerful, heartbreaking to see. And you talked about nonviolence not being passive, and he invokes actually loving the people who are oppressing you. So not just quietly standing by, which is remarkable. So maybe you could talk about that. And I also just wanted to, two quick things, you know, these images, which they took place in the spring of 1960. And I'm wondering what impact they had, much in the way, I guess, you know, Bull Connor using his fire hoses sort of engaged people who are horrified by it. How much did these events help, as horrible as they were? How much did they help to bring the movement forward, or not? Or maybe they were not helpful. I'm wondering if he or you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that violent response to peaceful teenagers, for the most part, sitting and requesting a Coke and a hamburger, absolutely horrified so much of America, much the way that the visuals of George Floyd being killed horrified so much of America and so many people around the world.
I think we might have. Dawn, I might have lost your audio for one moment. Sorry, there you are.
Yeah, let me see if it's. Is that back? No.
Yeah, we can hear you well. Your image is frozen, but we hear you. Oh.
Looks like Dawn dropped off, yeah. And hopefully she'll be right back.
So we can, maybe Holly, you want to, you'll be going through some of those questions, and maybe we'll just do one or two more clips for everybody, and then we'll go to.
Well, she's coming back. Do you want me to play the last clip?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Or you could also play the third one too. That's a good clip too. Yep. That airport clip is pretty nice.
Okay.
I'm back if you want to
wait hi, 1
second.
Great.
Sorry.
There we go. We got you, I think.
You know what I wanted. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that. What I wanted to point out from that clip as well was the amount of training that the young people experienced, and so that they were prepared. I really love the quote by Bernard Lafayette, who was a friend of Mr. Lewis's and a compatriot in the civil rights movement, where he said, "We had changed." And there is this acceptance of, you know, their mission, and their mission was to continue fighting until there was full equality. So,
yeah. One quick aside.
Internet connection.
Yeah. One quick aside as we move on, I just want to say that when Jackie Robinson broke in 16 years or 13 years before that, his charge, self-imposed, was to not fight back as well. Also adopting that, you know, that peaceful and calm response was the best way forward. I had just one sort of political question to ask you. John Lewis was elected to the House in 1987. He was a Democrat and has always been a Democrat. You know, when he was growing up, a lot of those Dixiecrats, Bull Connor, George Wallace, Strom Thurmond, James Eastland, the Democratic Party was on the wrong side of history. There's no doubt about it. Obviously, things have changed. How did he feel about that? Did he have any qualms about being a Democrat by 1987, or was there any point of conflict or friction for him?
No, I think by the 1980s, you know, the Democrats were clearly more the party of civil rights. I think the Black Caucus was increasing. I think he felt like that was the right the right home, that it was a more inclusive party, you know, and the place where he should be. But, you know, that conflict exists to this day. Is the Democratic Party really actually serving Black Americans the way they should? You know, it's so clear that we see in the 2020 election that it's you know, bittersweet for me to see, but sweet nonetheless, that Georgia delivered. You know, for Georgia voted blue. That was in no small part due to Stacey Abrams' efforts, but that was also John Lewis. Like, you know, he guided, mentored Stacey Abrams very, very closely during, you know, her political race. He campaigned for her really hard. He supported her, you know, and other candidates. So there was a legacy there that, and it was John Lewis's district that, you know, also delivered for John Ossoff and Reverend Warnock. Of course, John Lewis was a member of Ebenezer, of that congregation that Reverend Warnock is a pastor of. And one of the scenes in the film where he says the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered are looking down on us, that is filmed in his church, in Reverend Warnock's church. So you have John Lewis taking the pulpit that day, urging people to remember the sacrifices of the past, and urging people to go and vote. And now you have the pastor of that church, who is now a senator from Georgia. I mean, that is a remarkable, you know, kind of lineage to think about. So.
Yeah, this has come up in a chat, so let me just jump to it then. As you bring up Reverend Warnock, who would you say, or who would we also lost Elijah Cummings in 2019, and who would you say, or who might you think that John Lewis would say are the leaders now? Obviously James Clyburn, Stacey Abrams, who you mentioned. Are there particular people with whom this rests?
You know, I think it rests with all of them. I think it's an open field, and it's people's for the taking. You know, I've been encouraged by, you know, Adam Schiff's leadership in the House. I am a fan of Nancy Pelosi. I think she's been strong and intelligent and deliberate. Jim Clyburn also has a very long record of working for civil rights. But, you know, there are some really interesting newer members of Congress. Antonio Delgado from upstate New York is a really strong member, a really smart young African-American leader. So, but I think, you know, we're looking for the people to step forward in an intelligent, calm way, to bring people together, but to also be insistent. John Lewis's voice is going to be very, very missed in this congressional, you know, upcoming congressional cycle, where you have Joe Biden stepping into, as we all know, such a fractured country, a fractured Congress. One of the things that the congressman was very strong in was reaching across the aisle and finding commonality, at least on a, if nothing else, on a human level. And that we have members of Congress who may have participated in an insurrection against the government of the United States. That should never cease to be shocking, that our political differences could lead there. And so for people who say, you know, bygones be bygones, I don't agree with that. I think that you have to hold people accountable for their actions, and say that that is unacceptable, that, you know, that is violence that occurred in our nation's capital. I mean, I was just stunned by that. And I think that it's one of the many, many times when I wished that the congressmen were there to kind of calm people, but also say there's a reason why actions have consequences. And I think his voice is very much missed in this conversation.
Yeah. So I think maybe, I know you said you wanted to get to questions. We have so many people chiming in. Maybe we can go there. I'm just going to ask one last thing, and then you can maybe Holly be ready with whoever you want to queue up. Really more on a filmmaker's level, to get into your craft a little bit. There was a wonderful passage where he mentioned that some of these clips he had never seen before. And I thought to myself, you know, what an amazing gift you've given him. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about what it's like to see somebody, I guess, rediscover themselves or at least be reminded of themselves in that way.
Yeah, so we followed the congressman for a year. I filmed with him in Washington, D.C. at his home. We went to Troy, Alabama, where he grew up. We filmed him at work, you know, in the airport. There's a scene of people coming up to him. So many people came up to him, and he would always stop for them. We learned to give those, if we were filming with him in an airport, we learned to give extra time because he would always stop and speak to people. So, you know, but one of the things as a filmmaker is you have to find the place where someone can be fully attentive. And when he was in his office in Washington, which is beautiful, and, you know, there's all this memorabilia that was so important, but he was always going to vote, or if a constituent would stop by, he would always greet them. So he was distracted. And then when he was at home, you know, he's an older Southern person, and he was always worried that his house was messy, or, you know, he was distracted. So I decided we were at Bryan Stevenson's Civil Rights Museum in Alabama, which is a beautiful place. If you have not been there, it's really worth a family trip. And so we go in, and the congressman was, you know, walking around the Civil Rights Museum, and he comes to an exhibit that has footage of him, and he's watching an exhibit about himself. And I'm watching him watch this exhibit about himself. And there's this footage in there, and he's shaking his head, and he says, "Sometimes I can't believe that's me. I can't believe that's me." And he turns and he starts telling a story to a teenager who was touring the museum. And he starts telling a story I'd never heard before. I've read so many books and seen so many, you know, film clips about the congressman. And I thought that's what we should do. We should make him these small movies about his life and put him in a place where he can just react to it. And then I'm going to ask him to tell me the story. So we rented the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. It's a theater in the round. So we constructed screens all around him, put him in the center. We had like a lighting consultant come in and light it like a play, like he was giving a one-man play, and then cameras. And by this time, you know, we knew each other pretty well. I've been following him for almost a year. And so I was like, you know, Congressman. So, and then my editor, the wonderful Jessica Congdon, we created these long archival sequences of our favorite moments. And we would just play them for him on 3 screens. So anywhere he looked, he was watching. And sometimes we filmed him just reacting, but sometimes he would tell a story. So that's what we did. It's a lesson to always keep your camera running, because while we were changing the tape, he says, "Dawn, I'm seeing things I've never seen before." And the room just got completely silent. There are probably 40 people in that room, because we all realized what a tremendous moment that was. That was not expected. So I think he was talking about some specific footage in the training, but I think also he was talking about all of it. You know, he was talking about the experience of seeing so much footage uninterrupted by, you know, talking heads, of just so many things that he'd experienced. It's kind of like, I guess, if you scroll through a photo album. And so from there, I thought, because he was so passionate when he was describing these moments, I thought, oh, we should put him full direct to camera. Because if you're 80 years old and you've seen what he's seen and done what he's done, you should tell the story of your life. Nobody else should tell it. So those were just very much like decisions kind of on the fly.
Well, thank you for taking us into the weeds. It's just another illustration of why this film and your work in general is so remarkable. So thank you for taking us in. Holly, do you want to, or maybe Rabbi, I'm not sure who's going to MC this, but somebody's going to pull out a couple of the questions from the chat.
I've got it.
Okay, great.
I got it. A lot of really great questions. There's one question the rabbi posted from a participant that says the documentary is excellent and the use of the squad was a bit triggering given their public statements and positions. Can you reflect, Dawn, on the issue of coalitions when we don't agree on everything?
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to do was to, and this came from my experience in making Bobby Kennedy for president, is when you have people who are historical figures, you could fill your film with people saying nice things about them, or historians, or people who didn't know them. And I wanted to feature people. I wanted to focus on his current political career a lot because we focus a lot on the historic. And so I wanted his contemporaries, so Jim Clyburn, Elijah Cummings, Sheila Jackson Lee. So we did those interviews, but I also wondered what the new kind of generation of leader, because John Lewis was the outsider firebrand of his time. The NAACP did not agree with direct action. They did not agree with the sit-ins or the freedom rides, things that we now think, really caused us to get to a more equal country. And one of the things we weren't able to film, but I know that happened, is that Congressman Lewis sat down with the members of the squad, and they don't agree on action, but he told them his story, and he urged them to think about compromise as also a form of power, so that there is a way that you push, but you can push within the bounds of respect for the institution, which I think is so telling, considering the events of January 6th and the challenge to the institution, maybe by members of Congress. So I thought it was important to see. They also, it was very interesting, they get a lot of requests, but they all wanted to speak about his importance to them. So, let's give people time. They're learning. They're effective. I don't agree with everything, that people say, but I think it's interesting to know that somewhere there's a little bit of Congressman Lewis's words, and they did show a deep respect for him. So we shall see.
Great, thank you. Your friend Devora, a WJC member, of course, asked, did you come across or interview any whites who had opposed the protests at the time? They'd be in their 80s now. Did they express remorse or ask for forgiveness?
We didn't find people like that. I won't say I was, really looking. I think for me personally, and I know for the congressman, he was really welcoming anybody who would think about their actions and have, a change of heart about some things. There were a lot of Black people who didn't support the direct action as well. They didn't support discrimination, but they didn't support the direct action. So I know that the congressman was very much of a how do you feel now? How do you behave now? Forgiveness is a joy. And he would much rather, forgive anyone who he felt he was in the place to forgive. He didn't feel like it was his place to forgive, but he was very accepting of people. He also did something that was, often that was very inspiring to me, which is he took people at their word. And if you professed a desire to learn and to work together, he wouldn't question that. He wouldn't question your sincerity. No litmus tests for the congressman.
Great, thank you, Dawn. Roger Stavis asks, I have read that John Lewis was asked by Dr. King and the organizers of the March on Washington in August of '63 to temper some of the more radical elements of the speech he wanted to give at the rally. What did he want to say at that rally, and how did he change his speech?
Yeah, this is a great story. We touch on it a little bit in the film, but there's a much longer story. As I say, he was thought of as kind of a firebrand, and he wanted to talk, I think he wanted to talk about marching like Sherman through the streets of Birmingham. and the organizers of the march, who were, you know, a little bit more the old guard of the NAACP, they thought that that sounded inflammatory, as if they were like, you know, Antifa or something. And so they asked him to change the speech. So he had come, you know, he was in his 20s. He was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. And actually, we should play that clip, Holly, I think, because that, it's called
That's the fifth one, Holly.
Yeah.
Got it. And I think I'm queued up. Okay, hold on one second.
I think you need to unmute yourself, Holly.
Yeah, Holly, we need to just go back to.
That would make it unnecessary to march in the streets of Birmingham. Those who have said be patient, let us not forget that we are involved in a serious social revolution where it is a political party that will make it unnecessary to march on Washington. Where it is a political party that will make it unnecessary to march in the streets of Birmingham. Those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that we cannot be patient. If we do not get meaningful legislation out of this Congress, we will march through the South, through the streets of Jackson, through the streets of Danville, through the streets of Cambridge, through the streets of Birmingham. But we will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today. We must say, wake up, America, wake up, or we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient.
I love that clip so much because, you know, it shows just what I was saying, that he was, you know, the firebrand of his time. So that he toned it back, not by saying we will march like Sherman, which was like a, you know, overwhelming kind of almost like militaristic idea, which was not his idea. But, you know, there's also a direct challenge that we're not kidding. We are going to continue protesting until, you know, and there very specifically, they were looking for meaningful civil rights legislation. So that was before the Voting Rights Act, that was before all of these things that happened. So remember that President Kennedy was in office then, and Kennedy was not in support of the March on Washington. He thought that there could be violence, that there, you know, would be, you know, kind of, that there would be riots, that it would be bad. So they had the march. It was peaceful. After Congressman Lewis said Kennedy was beaming like a proud father, which I took out because I thought it was kind of like patronizing. But that's what he said. He's like, Kennedy was like slapping us on the back and saying like that we had done a good job. So it was you know, really, really interesting. When we think about, you know, and I think it directly relates to the question about the squad and AOC, you know, be interesting to put some of her speeches against some of the early speeches of the civil rights leaders and see how, you know, radical they are when we look back in history.
Thank you. The two questions are similar, so I'm going to combine them. One is from Hazan Ellen Arad, and one is from Laura Levon. Thank you for your questions. They're both asking about what we can do to continue the conversation. One as adults, and also one as young teens of color from New York who want to participate in making a difference.
Yeah, I think that it's, first of all, really important that our young people, but probably all of us, are reminded of our history, you know, and I alluded to that earlier on, that it is painful for me to see that you know, young people of color do not understand the coalitions that were formed around the civil rights movement. So I think having those conversations and seeing who actually took part in movements for change is one thing. But I think finding a place for gathering is really, really important. We are so segregated in our communities these days. That's largely a function of income. And so as income inequality has widened, there are fewer opportunities for us to be together. In New York City and surrounds, kids who go to private school don't interact with kids who go to public school. You have I went to Bronx Science. It was like 30% Black, and you just took the test to get in, and it was 30% Black. So now we don't have that. So we don't worship together. As greater inequality happens, we don't work together. So we have no places to really intimately know each other. So I think fostering a space, maybe partnering, with a youth group from a church, where you could kind of see your similarities, because we need to see each other as people, rather than our identifiers. I think that was what was so important about the multiracial coalition of the civil rights movement. And I think that's getting harder to do these days.
Thank you. Kostya, what do you think? A few more or one more, or how many more would you like to take?
Oh, it's really how long people want to go, and I don't want to keep Dawn too long. It's 12:05. Maybe we take one more. And then I don't know if you wanted to see that airport clip on the way out, if people haven't seen it. I know you alluded to it, Dawn. It's a beautiful clip of him greeting people. So could metaphorically be saying goodbye.
I see people are still hanging on, so we can go.
Yeah, you want to play that clip and then take one more question and
sounds good.
Or the other way around, and that'll be like a really nice way to.
Hold on, and I do apologize for technical issues. Me
too.
Apologize for that, but let me get this one up.
Dawn, also looking at him at the March on Washington, obviously he talked about the influence of Dr. King, and they were obviously, could you just take maybe one beat further into that? How close really were they? What was his response to the assassination? It would still be 20 years before he was actually in Congress, and maybe just take us in there a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So his activism really began with a letter to Dr. King. John Lewis wanted to go to Troy College, which is now Troy University, in his home city of Troy, Alabama. And he wrote and applied, and he didn't receive a response. And he thought it was because of race, because he had really good grades. So he wrote a letter to Dr. King, and Dr. King sent him a bus ticket. And so he got on the bus and went to visit Dr. King and Thurgood Marshall. And Dr. King said, "Is that you? Is that John Lewis, the boy from Troy?" And Dr. King called John Lewis the boy from Troy for the rest of their time together. And so Marshall and King told John Lewis wanted to sue the university. And they told him that he needed to get the permission of his family, because he said, your house could be bombed, you could be killed, your parents could lose the land. His parents were sharecroppers. They had worked, for decades in order to save money to get the land. And his father was for suing to integrate the university. His mother was really terrified, and so they didn't do it. But that was the beginning of their relationship. And so when he went to Fisk University, he started training and going to these civil rights meetings, but he was deeply influenced by King. He was definitely a lieutenant, close relationship. Jim Lawson, who trained the civil rights workers, was really one of the people who Dr. King relied on most, and who helped form his view of nonviolence, which then directly informed John Lewis's view of nonviolence. So they worked together very, very closely. They were very close. It was the most important influence in his life. When Dr. King was killed, he actually went into a deep depression. It was a really, really difficult time for him. He was volunteering for Bobby Kennedy's campaign. And so Bobby Kennedy was John Lewis volunteered to rally African-American groups to go see Bobby Kennedy, because as we know, Blacks, really delivered for the Democratic candidates, starting in the 60s and going forward. Bobby Kennedy needed the Black vote in order to win. That's what had put John F. Kennedy over the top. Bobby Kennedy needed that constituency. So John Lewis was a really critical volunteer organizer for Kennedy. Kennedy was in Indianapolis at a rally that John Lewis had organized for him. And just before Kennedy was to go out and address the crowd, they learned that Dr. King had been killed. Kennedy's white advisors, older advisors, said, you can't go speak to this crowd. They're going to riot. It's too dangerous. John Lewis, who was in his 20s, said, you must speak to them. And Kennedy did. And it's known as one of the most important speeches that Kennedy's ever given, one of his best speeches. It's the only time that he ever referred to his brother's assassination in a public speech. You can see there's footage of it if you watch Bobby Kennedy for President and you watch this episode, which I encourage you to do, because John Lewis really breaks down and says how important Kennedy was to him. Kennedy had written on his hand quotes from a poem. Indianapolis so Bobby Kennedy tells the Black Indianapolis audience that Martin Luther King Jr. has died. He's the person who delivers that news. Indianapolis is one of the only cities that did not have riots that day. And people think it is largely because Kennedy delivered that news, acknowledged the anger, and John Lewis was an integral part of that. So there's a lot of history among and between all of those people.
Thank you so much for that. Holly, if you're able, maybe we could show that last clip and then wrap up. It's a nice, warm way to hear goodbye.
Okay, hang on.
Hi, John Lewis.
Hi, how you doing?
Oh, I want to meet my old lady.
Hi, how you doing, young lady? Hi, good to see
man,
you.
I appreciate everything you do, man.
Thank you. Thank you. How you doing? Hi, good to see you.
Pleasant surprise.
Good to see you.
You're my hero.
Well, thank you, brother.
I just want to thank you for all your service.
Thank you.
For all these years. We really look up to you.
What is it like walking through an airport with him?
Tedious.
How you doing? Fine, good to see you.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Something that might take 30 minutes could take an hour and 30 minutes.
Hello, how you doing this
So
morning?
nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
I've had to impersonate John a number of times. And the reason is that I'll have a whole family to come up. And they're saying, Johnny, this is John Lewis. And I'm like, I don't want to embarrass the parents. I don't want to, I've gotten a lot of pictures taken where people just assume that I was John Lewis. But you know what? I am so glad that they mistake me for a great man.
That is another one of my favorite clips. That was the first interview we did with Congressman Elijah Cummings. We did not know that he would pass away before the film was completed. And that's another, we were talking and, having serious conversation. And then he started saying, that whole, people think I'm John Lewis. And I said, Congressman, are you telling me you impersonate John Lewis? And then he gave that huge laugh and he told the story about, and of course, he ends and he says, mistaken for a great man, when of course he was a great man. So, this movie is filled with so much love and respect. People who loved and honored the congressman, but you see, for me, some of the most moving is how people would greet him in those airports. You see the person who's working in the fast food store say, "Are you okay?" And he says, "I'm fine." Those are the people that he lived a life of service, but his life of service was not a burden, it was a joy. And I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have spent time with someone who really, from all he have seen, had lived his life so joyfully and so fully. I just once again want to thank Devorah for connecting us. I want to thank you all for being here. It's almost 100 people here on a Sunday in a pandemic, and that is really heartwarming. This is a lovely service for me. It feels like a Sunday service to be with all of you. So thank you so much.
We're so grateful to have you here. I'm sure Holly and Rabbi want to say something, but for me, thank you so much for taking the time. And to Sojak and Rabbi, thank you for letting me be part of this. It was wonderful. So thanks so much, Dawn.
Rabbi, before I close, would you like to say something?
Oh, I just want to say thank you to Dawn, to Kostya, to Sojak, to all of you for being here. It's really inspiring. I feel very inspired. I hope everyone else to just seeing those clips, and it's very hopeful. It's been a hopeful couple weeks, and like I needed it, and I really appreciate the inspiration, appreciate the storytelling. I look forward to all of us coming together again for more conversations like this over the near future. I hope you'll pay attention to the programs coming out of Sojak on this topic. There's a couple of them certainly next month in March, and going forward. So I hope you'll all continue the conversation with us.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Kostya. And on behalf of the Sojak Committee and Westchester Jewish Center, we are so grateful to all of you for your time this morning, your enthusiasm, Dawn, and your willingness to address one of the most pressing issues of our day. So thank you. Thank you so much. And I also want to give a shout out to Sharon Silver and Ruth Oberbright Glass from Sojak, who worked tirelessly on this project. And also, of course, again, Devorah Rubino, who was a colleague of yours many years ago and offered to make the initial contact setting this event in motion. So thank you so much, Devorah. And as the rabbi said, we do have more events coming up. There's one on March 14th with Rabbi Noah Marans from the American Jewish community, who will speak to us about anti-Semitism. Information can soon be found on the website. And if any of you didn't get a chance to watch Good Trouble, you can still do so until tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the information is found on our website as well. And if you want to watch Dawn's film The Way I See It, which is equally impressive and spectacular, you can find that on the new Peacock channel. So again, thank you everybody so much for spending your time with us, and have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.